Audit readiness and evidence management can be quite an involved process in terms of all the necessary moving parts. Over at this point, we're going to be looking at an high level the steps and necessary things that are involved in terms of, in this case scenario, building an audit PBC list and evidence plan for SOC 2, in addition to identifying gaps and remediation owners as part of that overall process. So what we're going to be doing at this point is to pretty much highlight all the necessary pieces that are involved when it comes on to your audit PBC list. So let me quickly change here. So typically these are some of the various elements that are involved in terms of creating your list. This, your gap, your remediation, your evidence, and the necessary dashboard. However, one of the first thing that you want to establish at this point is to have an understanding. When we speak about PBC list or creating a PBC list, as is outlined here, build an audit PBC list. That's the first thing you need to have an understanding of. What are we referring to? So a PBC list represents prepared by. That's prepared by. So let me just place this right here for clarity. So when you think about your PBC list, so that's your PBC list. And if we should extend this, so it's prepared by. So moving forward, always bear this in mind. Bear this in mind. PBC. And this is a structured list of all the documents, your evidence, and data that the auditors request from the organization to perform an audit. So in the case of SOC 2, then it becomes your evidence backbone to prove, for example, that the necessary controls exist, the controls are designed properly, and lastly, that the controls are operating effectively over time. Great. So think of it this way, and we're going to be, let me simply share with you an analogy in terms of how you can actually think of your PBC list or your PBC list like a shopping list for auditors. So if we look at it from this perspective, then here you have, for example, the auditor's needs, and then this is what you provide. So this is your PBC in terms of thinking about your PBC listing. What the auditors need, what is it that you need to provide? And let us add. Okay, so there we have this, and we can also maximize for better clarity. So your auditors need, what is it that you need to provide? So for example, in this case, we have proof of access review happens. You provide the access reports. Proof logs are monitored, then you need to provide the SIEM alerts and reports. Proof onboarding is controlled. You provide the IAM workflows. So that's, in short, what the PBC listing is. Now, in order to actually establish the structure of your PBC for your SOC, going back to our case, always bear in mind what we're trying to establish. So at this point, we're trying to establish the audit PBC list and evidence plan for SOC 2. So in light of this, then first thing you need to do is to create a structure of a SOC 2 PBC list. So quickly, let me share with you what a structure will look like for your PBC list as in relation to SOC 2. So this becomes a structure for your SOC 2. Right? So when you are establishing or creating your table design, then this would be the structure. Each column, so you would have your control ID, your control description, the evidence required, the source system, the owner, frequency, period, status, gap, remediation. These are the things that you need to be capturing as part of that listing. So a strong PBC list typically includes all of these elements. And of course, your control ID example, bearing in mind that we're working with SOC 2, your control description in terms of what the control does, what auditors want, the source system, and the list goes on. So here we have an example of this. For example, this would be a layout designed of your PBC list. The ID, the control description, evidence, source, owner, frequency. That's the overall structure of your PBC listing. Secondly, you want to start with the SOC 2 criteria. And when you talk about the criteria, then you're looking at the various categories. For example, security, availability, those are the various categories associated with your SOC 2. And let me just uh, share with you an example of what I'm actually referring to at this point in time in terms of looking at your SOC 2 criteria. If I quickly add this here. So this would be an example of your SOC 2 criteria. So you start with your SOC 2 criteria. For example, these are the various categories associated with SOC 2. For example, security, availability, confidentiality, processing integrity, privacy. Example of a control. This is how we refer to the SOC 2 control. CC 6.1, logical access control. Great. So once that is established, then the second thing has to do with mapping the controls to evidence. Great. So let's just create an additional sheet here. And this has to do with, let me just add this here. And of course, there are systems that have the capability of doing this far more efficiently. So you want to map controls to the necessary evidence that you have. So let's say, for example, in this case, we could have typical example would be in your sheet when you're designing. Say you would have, for example, the control and the evidence. So you're looking at access provisioning, then you're mapping those to the necessary evidence. So you have your control based on the SOC 2, control list of family or family listing, access provisioning, evidence, user access, request tickets. That's the information that the auditors would use for uh, assurance to check whether or not this is actually in place and testing the effectiveness of those controls. So access reviews, the necessary evidence. The MFA has control, the necessary evidence. So that's the second phase, mapping the controls to evidence. Third thing you want to do at this point is to build the PBC listing. And a sample of your PBC listing would be, let us create a sample of a PBC listing. So third phase here is to build your PBC listing. And we could extend all of these. So this is your PBC listing. Let's just maximize this as well. So that's step 3. Let me just place this right here. So this is your PBC listing. Great. And you can design this as decorated as you want. The most important thing is to understand the various steps that are involved. So sheet one, we look at establishing what the auditors need. Two, we look at the overall design of the structure. Three, we are looking at mapping the control evidence. And here we have, let's go back to here. Step three, build a PBC table. So, and on the PBC table, you have your control ID, the various control, the evidence required, the owners of these evidence and controls, and the status, whether they are in progress, they have not started, they have been submitted, or they are in progress, or there's a gap between what needs to be implemented and whether or not that has been achieved. So that is documented here by the auditors. Fourth step is to identify where the gaps are. And of course, the gaps refers to where you have missing, incomplete, or weak evidence. And there are a number of, so in many cases, as it relates to gap types, you have, let me just provide with you as well an idea when we talk about gaps and various different types of gaps that could exist in a system. So, for example, when it relates to your gaps, then when you're talking about gaps, then you have various gap types. So you have no evidence, which refers to, in this case, no access review performance or performed. You have incomplete gap type, which looks at the fact that review is done but not documented. You have inconsistent gap in terms of control not performed regularly, or you have weak design as a gap, no approval workflow in place. So that's what we mean when we talk about gaps. So there are various types of gaps. Great. So the next phase of the process, and if we go back to our task involves, so we have completed creating the PBC listing. We looked at the evidence plan for the SOC 2 as part of this. We look at the gap, and now let's look at the remediation. So as part of this remediation, and we can add an additional sheet as part of our remediation process is to assign remediation owners. So this is a typical example of what our remediation process or plan can look in as it relates to your design. And these are the fields. So for example, as part of this, you could have what the issue, for example, then you have the risk, issue, risk, action, owner, due date. Those are the key things that you need as part of this overall process. Your issue, your risk, your action, your owner, your due date. And you add those to your sheets. So in this case, an example would be no quarterly access review. The risk could be unauthorized access. The action could be implement view process, the owner, and the due date. That's where the gap lies. Having completed looking at your gap. Then based on the gap, then you develop what the remediation would be. And of course, you assign the necessary remediation owners who need to address these challenges. So once you have established this, then this next step would be to establish your evidence plan. That's to build the evidence plan, and the evidence plan equals to how you will actually collect the evidence consistently over a period of time. And this could be, for example, let us look at an example of evidence collection. So your evidence plan may look something like this. So there we have our evidence plan. For example, your control, what the evidence associated evidence, the source, the frequency, and automation. So what this does is actually help you to impress the auditors and hiring managers in the fact that you will link evidence directly to systems, you will ensure timestamps, the audit trails, you show consistency over time, you maintain version control documents, automate where possible. So all of this in terms of this PBC list is the bridge between your controls and your audit success. So if your PBC list is weak, your audit will fail, not because controls don't exist, but simply because you cannot prove that they actually exist in the organization. So in a nutshell, when you think of your PBC listing, then these are unnecessary moving parts that are associated as part of this overall process. And of course, this templates, and there are a number of additional templates that speaks to this process that I will also provide you with as part of your experimentation and developing your skills when it comes on to undertaking tasks such as audit readiness and evidence management. And of course, I always refer you to the various collections of courses that I have that's actually deep dive into these various skill sets at a far more advanced level that you can actually explore as well.